Hello, welcome to a series that I'm working on, a guide to watercolor for beginners from someone who has gotten into watercolor fairly recently. I would still count myself as a beginner. I have learned so much though, and I wanted to make this series to talk about those things, to explore those things in ways that I wish I had seen, ways that work well with my brain. This is basically the guide to watercolor that I wish I stumbled upon. So today, what I want to go through are some of the things that make watercolor unique, talk about what watercolor is and some of its properties, some of the things we should be aware of going into things. So let's start with what watercolor is. Essentially with watercolor, we are using water to control and move paint or pigment around. So watercolor paints are typically made up of pigment and some binder. Usually the binder is gum arabic. This paint by Core does use a different binder called Aquazol, but they're essentially performing the same function. And then you're also going to have some other additives or stabilizers in there. Basically, as a rule of thumb, the more expensive the paint is, the more pigment is in the paint. So a lot of the more cost-effective options for watercolor paints are going to have less pure pigment in them than the artist grade, more expensive version. Commonly for formats, you're going to see things like cakes or pans. Generally, they're going to be dry in this format or close to dry. They might have a little bit of moisture in them. And you can buy them that way. Some brands will sell individual cakes or pans. Some brands will sell full kits with cakes or pans. And then there's also the option to fill your own cakes or pans out of the other format, which is tubes. You can use the paints straight out of the tube, but generally you're going to use water to dilute it because out of the tube it's like really, really potent, and you're also probably going to use way more paint than you need to. A little bit of paint goes a really long way. Sometimes it's almost like a little bit too much. Like I don't like to waste paint, and sometimes like you just want the real estate back for like a mixing area. Just to be clear, the format does not determine the quality of the paint. In terms of what you will likely see most as a beginner, those are the two formats that I see most often. So in terms of roles that water plays, so we have the water that is used to basically move our paint around, water that is used to activate. So any of this dried paint here, I can activate that with water, just a tiny bit of water, we'll get that paint flowing. The lovely bits with water activation is, A, you're not carrying a lot of liquid with you when you're traveling, right? Like this is very concentrated. We're not just carrying extra liquid around. The other thing is that we can activate and clean surfaces like this really, really easily. If I wanted to get all of this off of this plate, like I have over here, I just need a little bit of water, need a cloth, wipe it up, super easy peasy. Another thing to keep in mind with the water activation of watercolors is you can reactivate your paints when they are on the paper as well. Generally, it takes a little bit of fussing over the area to do that. You can usually paint over a dry layer of paint, but if you are really taking your time, or if you have a paint that is a little more prone to lifting, which is a characteristic of a paint, sometimes those paints will actually reactivate quite easily, and that might be something you want. It also might be something you don't want. Sometimes that's what we use for a technique to kind of correct some mistakes, and sometimes that's something we want to definitely avoid. You can also use water to get different effects. So I will talk more about that in another video that I'm planning where I'm talking about different terms and techniques within watercolor. But basically, there's a lot of different things you can do with water to get different effects, to have different techniques at your disposal. And so like having water on paper, for example, before you put paint is going to do different things than if you put paint directly on paper without the water on there before. A lot of the key things to understand with watercolor are how water moves, where water is going to want to go, and understanding the wetness and dryness of the different surfaces. So your mixture of paint and water, your water on your brush, and your water on your paper. All of those things are things to kind of balance with the watercolors. Another thing that water is really huge for in watercolor is affecting the lightness or darkness of a paint. In watercolor, it's generally advised to lighten your colors using water. It is just generally easier than mixing colors. Generally, when you mix a color, you are going to get a darker color. If you were to say mix white to try and lighten, you can mix white with colors. Absolutely. Do not let anybody tell you you cannot do that. But it's going to change some of the properties of that color. You're going to change some of the properties of the paint mixture that you're going to be putting on paper. Sometimes it's going to make things look just more pastel-y, and it can also just have some other effects that you may not be wanting. So just keep that in mind. You can do it, but do you want to? Possibly not. But feel free to experiment. By all means, like anything that I share with you that is like a rule, try it out. Try breaking it. Try intentionally messing around with it and seeing how you feel about that rule. Because a lot of things, like there's so many things that I had heard when I was like starting out that I was like, okay, what does that rule even mean? And getting your own understanding of it and why it may or may not apply to you, why you may want to follow that, and why you might want to break that, I think is so, so valuable. So if I wanted to paint something very, very light, um, so see how I'm just activating this paint that had dried? Like I said, I can do. This actually might be a little bit stronger of a paint than I want to put down on paper. If I picked that paint up and I put it down right now like that, that is how dark that line is showing up. Now I'm going to add a little bit of water to my brush. I haven't done anything else besides tap it off the rim of the glass, and I've got a lighter line. If I do that one more time, I've dipped it. I'm just rubbing the paint brush off the rim of the glass that I'm using. And then I'm just going to do another line. Should get another one there. And you can kind of keep doing that until you run out of color. So I've gotten nice and diluted. And I can also do that by just diluting the mixture of paint and water that I have in here. So there's a few different ways that you can do that. One way I love to use is a syringe, and I just kind of drop a little bit of extra water in there, and then you can mix it around. So I've got, it looks a little lighter already on the palette here. And if I then do a line next to that top one, should be able to see that's a little lighter than that mixture there. If I added a little bit more water, same thing, it would get lighter and lighter. So water is how we are controlling the what's called value, the lightness or the darkness of the paint. The darkest that we can get from a specific paint is going to be basically the most concentrated we can get it. So the least amount of water. And we can make paints look darker by mixing or by layering. So another thing that watercolor is very well known for is its transparency. And when we talk about transparency with watercolor, I kind of think of it basically in how much we can see what is under the layer of paint that we have applied. So to make things kind of confusing, watercolors are described as a transparent medium, but the paints themselves come in different ratings of transparent, semi-transparent, semi-opaque, and opaque. So make it make sense? So one of the things I've seen done a lot for showing transparency in watercolor is doing a big black line and letting that dry. So using something that is not water soluble, not something that is going to reactivate when we use water. And then putting our paints on top of that line after it's dried. And we should be able to see that some paints are going to look a little bit more like they're sitting on top of that black line, and some are going to look like they're sitting more behind the black line, or we can like barely tell where they are. And so that's going to give you an idea as to if the paint leans more towards opaque, which is going to look more like it's sitting on top. It may also look a little chalky. And then if you have a more transparent paint, it's going to look a little bit more like it's sitting underneath, or like the black has like the slightest color tint. It might be easier for you to think of transparency and opacity in terms of like hiding power. So how well will the paint cover what is underneath it? Depending on your paints, depending on the brand and the grade of paint that you have, you may have ratings for the transparency or opacity. That might be on your tube or it might be listed online. So for example, the Winsor Newton Cotman line, they don't list their opacity on the tube. I actually went to their list online and wrote down the a letter T or an O or whatever for what it's rated as, because they don't have it on their tube, but they do have a really easy to reference chart online. In general, a lot of beginner resources are going to explain to you some version of this. They're going to tell you how to see if your paint is opaque or transparent. And they're generally going to advise that the transparent paints are really key to getting some of the main lovely effects that you can get with watercolor for layering. So I wanted to explore this a little bit more than just transparent paints are better for layering. To me, there's a lot more to experiment with. Basically, in watercolor, we have a technique called glazing, which is where we take a layer of paint that we've allowed to dry, and then we apply another layer of paint, usually a different color in a fairly diluted version of it, and we apply that on top. And generally what you're going to get is basically a color mix. So rather than it being like you have just smacked a new color on top, you're usually going to get closer to if you actually mix those two colors together. So you do want to be mindful of like how colors interact for when you're doing those techniques. This is actually kind of a cool way that I saw to like experiment with that glazing and what it'll do over different colors. So here I did the background first on this, and then I added the colors for these flowers and stuff after. And you can kind of see where there's the differences in colors, how they affect some of these a little bit more than others, especially like this one here with the yellow. It's really cool seeing how that pink will affect over here and over here, how it affects the green over here. So pretty. But I would really suggest like just playing around with stuff like this to see the effects that you're going to get when you are putting a layer on top of a layer. Basically, the feature of transparency comes down to the particle size of the pigment and also the ratio of pigment to binder. The smaller the particles, the more transparent the paint generally is. The larger the particles, the more opaque. Paints will have general qualities of being more opaque or transparent, but within watercolor, they're still going to have transparent aspects to them, even when they are opaque, especially if you have them diluted. So some paints that are stronger or darker, as I like to think of them, can be rated as transparent and still have hiding ability. So I have three colors that I consider just like darker colors. When you get them out, they are just darker to start with. And so I've got Prussian blue, Viridian hue, and dioxazine purple. And all three of these are rated as transparent, but at a high concentration, this is like right out of the tube kind of high concentration, we are getting some significant coverage or inability to see what is underneath. So I've done 4 different lines, 3 in Sharpie, 1 in pencil, trying to be kind of dark with it, and I would say they did quite a good job in covering those lines. So one might argue that there is some hiding or coverage that is happening there. The other thing to keep in mind is that dilution plays a huge role in transparency. So yes, if we have paints that are not diluted really at all, then we might have some ability to cover things, and that can also depend on the specific paint, but dilution can also make an opaque paint have more transparent properties. So what I did here is I took paints kind of in a, not their full strength, but like basically I just dipped them right in the paint, and then I added more water kind of going down here. And all 3 of these paints were rated as opaque, but all 3 of these paints, even at their like not pure out of the tube mass tone, we've still got some transparency there. And as we add more water, we are going to get more transparency. So basically, keys are Watercolor is known to be a transparent medium, but yes, there are some paints that are rated as more opaque, but opaque paints still have some transparent properties to them. They're still not going to have the same like opaque level that like an acrylic paint or a gouache might have. So it's important to keep in mind that these paints do have these features for a few different reasons. For one, for understanding how we kind of plan things out and what we want to see in our finished product. So, for when we are doing a sketch or an outline, do we want to see the sketch lines when we are done? If we don't, generally what's advised is to like sketch really lightly with pencil. Try and erase kind of as much as you can and still get like just enough to see what you're doing. Then you'll probably be able to barely see it when you are done. You could also try outlining with watercolor pencil crayons. I have tried that. You can also just not do outlines. You can play around with all sorts of different things. But just keep it in mind that like if you go really hard in your pencil and you don't erase anything, then you might still see your pencil lines, and that might be fine. You also might love the look of what's called ink and wash, which is where people are generally doing like a darker ink-like outline, and then using watercolor to kind of color in those areas. I love the look of ink and wash. And you can do that by putting the lines first and then basically coloring in afterwards. So it just depends on what you want to see in your finished piece. Do you want to work with those lines showing through, or do you want to try to find a way to hide lines for your sketches? I wanted to explore the glazing and layering a little bit. So like I said, glazing is where we are taking a dry layer of paint and then adding a new layer of paint, generally in kind of a thinner layer. And we're basically usually going to get a mixing effect. So first, what I wanted to show is what happens if I layer transparent paint over transparent paint. So I picked 4 different columns where I did 2 different transparent paints, and I swapped the order for each just to see how different it would be when I went with a different order. And generally, like, they're very, very similar, I would say. And generally, they're very, very similar regardless of the order. Granted, there's things that I can't really control super well, like how concentrate, like exactly the concentration that I used. But in general, I would say they look quite similar, and we do get that mixing effect that is happening. Then what I did was opaque paint over transparent paint and transparent paint over opaque paint, just to see the differences there. To be honest, I still see a mixing effect happening. You can take a look at what I've done and let me know what you think, but I would say the key difference is like it kind of does change a little bit about like the texture of the look of it. I don't know if this is gonna make sense or like what technical words to use, but I do feel like the paint looks a little bit thicker. It looks a little bit more, we definitely can't see as much of the paper underneath, and so it does have a almost like flatter look to it, maybe a like thicker and flatter, if it makes sense, if that makes sense. But you take a look and let me know what your thoughts are. So with that transparency, I think another kind of key thing to keep in mind is that as we add layers, we do get darker. What I've done here is I did paint in up to 5 different layers and just showed how it got darker over time. But it also, I had the permanent marker written down for the number of the layers before I put the paint down. And I can still see those numbers quite fine. So I think it's just important to remember that even though we can make the paint look darker while we're adding these layers, you may still end up seeing things. Even if you add more and more layers and things get darker, we still might keep some of that transparency. So we still might not be able to cover things up if we have things that are really dark underneath. So another thing that I think is kind of key to understand is that it's easier to add darkness to a painting with watercolor than it is to get lightness back. So with the transparency, like when we have the colors interacting on the page, we are generally going to see a little bit of that white coming through the paper. And that white through the paint is going to make the paint look a little bit lighter. As we start covering things up and as we start adding layers, as we start adding layers and getting darker, we can't really get that lightness back with a transparent paint. We're going to get darker over time, but we can't really cover up the darkness that we're building, if that makes sense. So with a white opaque paint, for example, we hypothetically could. We can get that lightness back a little bit maybe, but as a general rule of thumb, again, this is kind of one of those general rules where there's some workarounds for this. But as a general rule of thumb, it is easier to go darker than it is to go lighter. So I kind of think of this similar to like a haircut where you can get your haircut shorter. You can always choose, if you're stuck between two lengths, you could cut your hair to the longer of the two lengths, see how you like it, and then decide to go shorter. But going shorter you're not gonna be able to automatically get that length back. You have workarounds. You can get extensions. You could get a wig and have that length back, but it's generally going to be very hard to get that length back right away. With the paint, you can go darker, but if you go too dark, if you go too short, if you go too dark, just like if you go too short, it's going to be hard to get that lightness back in your paintings. I wanted to use that to jump off into that rule of thumb that in watercolor, we paint light to dark. So I don't know if you've heard that already, but I've heard it quite a lot of times. And basically it confused me in the beginning because I think of light and like dark colors as like blues and purples and a lighter color as like a yellow. Generally, you know, like there's some lighter purples or whatever, like in my brain, that's kind of how I think of colors. But that's not really what it's referring to. It's really referring more to the values, which it comes down to the dilution of the paint. So the more water in your paint mixture, the more diluted and the less strong of a value, the lighter your color will be. So I just did for a little example here that I've taken 3 colors I kind of consider dark that as you dilute can actually be quite light and fine to use as like an initial layer. So I just want to make it clear because like for me, I'm like, oh, okay, you can't use black in an initial layer, but you actually can. And I actually kind of like using grays sometimes to block areas out when I'm kind of planning things rather than using like a pencil crayon or a pencil. Then it'll allow me to like figure where I'm putting things. Already putting it on top of paint, but with like a light enough layer that it's not going to really ruin or muddy and darken the look of things too much. So that rule of thumb is really about how it is way easier to add darkness than it is to add lightness back. You can do your watercolors like basically however you want to, but if you want to have layers, if you want to have some dimension, if you want to have some shadows and some lighter spots, if that's something you like in paintings, if that's something you want to learn, if that's a skill you want to have, then the light to darkness rule might be something you want to follow. If you want to just color things one flat color, have at her. Light to darkness rule, we don't know her. Just do whatever you want. I really think it's important to touch on why we have certain rules and when you can break them, because like nobody is the boss of you with this. Like if you are doing this for a hobby, if you are doing this just to feel some joy in your life, do not worry about rules. Just be aware of why they exist and if they will apply to you, if they might be handy for you. So I did want to show you another thing here. I did these out of order, but how concentrated or diluted a first layer of paint is can influence how the layer on top of it appears. So kind of similar to those things we already said, but basically what I did here is I did 2 of the same color twice, once light and once in a darker value. So basically a high pigment ratio. So basically a lot of the pigmented paint, very little water, just basically enough for me to like put it down. And then I added colors on top after it was dried. So one thing I noticed is not only does the like mixing look a little different, I had applied the color on top and it just like reactivates the paint so much more. It like accidentally kind of lifts the paint off easier when the paint is on thicker than when it is on lighter. So just keep that in mind also. So your layering is going to look different. It's going to all look darker, but it's also like not as pleasant of an experience to layer thick layers on top of each other. Like I think it probably has to do with the paper absorption, like how much kind of gets sucked and where it sits. And like if you have a very thick layer of paint, how it sits on the paper is probably quite different, and therefore the way that it activates is probably quite different. And there are different factors that also play into something like that, like the properties of the actual paint and what it wants to do when it's sitting on paper. So lots of different factors that could be at play there, but I just found it quite interesting that it happened on that side, but it didn't happen on that side. Okay, one more thing I wanted to show for the transparency is that mixing transparent paints with opaque ones can result in an opaque mixture. So I showed here, I did this like a while back and I just wanted to paste it on here. Basically what I did was I mixed some paints with white. So to show like, I don't think they really look necessarily lighter, but they did look more pastel-y, if that makes sense. Like the quality of the color kind of changes, but not in the same way that adding water does. And it also did change the opacity. So how it shows up on that black line did change. Kind of bouncing back off that transparency, we've also got how white is usually achieved with watercolor. So often the white of the page is what is used for white, especially in the more traditional sense. That can be achieved through just leaving space blank, or by using masking fluid if you're kind of worried about accidentally going over certain areas. Masking fluid is basically a liquid latex that is applied to the paper. Usually you're going to kind of basically rub it off after you have finished with it. You can also mask off or block off paint for getting onto certain areas with other things as well, like masking tape or washi tape. You can also use things like white gouache. There are some white opaque watercolors. The degree of opacity between using a white gouache versus watercolor might be a little different. Generally, a lot of people like to use the white gouache, but you could play with either one. I personally like to use white liquid watercolor sometimes in like a full concentration. I find that works okay for me. I've also used this white paint marker, so things like an acrylic paint marker basically would do the job. Also, white gel pens are also another option that some people like. There are some times where basically lifting color off of a page will provide close to your white, but that will depend on the paint that you're using and your paper. So I would not bank on that as a way to get your white back. There is also the option of like actually scraping the paint off of paper. You do want to be careful with that you're not damaging your paper too much, going a little too deep. You could also try using sandpaper for this type of technique. So another thing that makes watercolor kind of unique is how much the paper plays a role. So watercolor paper is kind of unique in some of its features. Watercolor paper basically has different textures to it. It also has a certain amount of thickness. It may be made out of cotton, and it also is going to have like a sizing added to it that's going to affect how the paint is absorbed into paper. One of my creative inspirations slash creative heroes is Linda Berry. She completely revolutionized like how I see making art and drawing. And one of the things that she shows that I've seen her do in like her teachings for making comics and also just stuff that I've seen from her work is she does use watercolors to paint comics, but she will often do these things without watercolor paper. And I've seen some exercises that she does like on composition book paper. So I decided to give it a try to feel the difference of painting on a composition book paper versus painting on watercolor paper, which is what I'm used to. And yeah, it's possible. It's going to look different. Like it's just going to show up differently. And it's also going to not allow you, and it's also not going to allow you to do a lot of different effects. Basically, what you're going to be limited to is like coloring in and layering. So you can get layers on top of layers as it dries. That will be something you can still hypothetically do. Um, and you can also like get color on paper. If you want to just practice to get like control of a brush, I think this would be a great option if you want to just like not spend a lot of money on those types of practice. Feel free to like experiment with using regular paper for certain techniques you want to practice. If you want to save your watercolor paper for practicing other things, absolutely feel free. One thing I was not prepared for was how just painting with watercolors on this type of paper made the paper so crinkly. Like, let me just show you. This is one page, front and back, for watercolor. Like, it is like very noisy. That's what a regular piece of paper sounds like. Be prepared for it absorbing quite differently, for it behaving quite differently, for you maybe not being able to do certain effects. A lot of the different techniques that you can do with watercolor, a lot of the durability you might want from paper, you're going to get that more from a watercolor paper than you are from most other types of paper. If you just want a paper that you can throw color on, there are other options for sure. Like I think Linda Berry, she's also used like index cards for things. I haven't tried that yet, but yeah, how you use watercolor, again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. You get to choose what you want out of your watercolor experience. If you want to just basically color, if you just enjoy moving a brush around and putting color down, feel free to use whatever paper you want. Recently, I played around with using watercolors on top of cardboard, and I was actually surprised how much I enjoyed that. You are limited in what you will be able to do, but for just kind of coloring, putting some color on something, it was quite nice. So another thing that helps my understanding of watercolor is basically thinking of it as having a lot of different variables that can affect your outcome. So like we talked about already, we've got paper, the type of paper that you use, the texture of the paper, the maker of the paper can have influence on like the sizing aspect and stuff like that. There's also the angle that you have your paper can make a difference. There's things like the area that you are in, the humidity that you have, the heat that you have, if you're outside versus inside, that's going to affect how things dry, how things perform. So even with paints, our paints can have very different characteristics even when they are from the same brand and the same line. Watercolor paints, they're affected so much by the aspects of the pigments in a way that I don't think a lot of other paints are. At least for myself, like I have really noticed differences between different paints within the same paint lines. As an example, I've got like a few core paints that I wanted to experiment with, and one of them is basically this texture of like glue. Like I don't know how else to explain it, but it's the only paint that I've played with so far that is gluey in texture. Like it just, even like as I let it dry and stuff, as soon as I add like a little bit of water, it gets back to that gluey texture. But all three of the other ones, no gluey texture, like not the same texture at all. But that yellow, for some reason, feels really gluey. So pigments have a lot of their own personalities and quirks, and those personalities and quirks are what we end up seeing in terms of a lot of the different properties that a paint can have in terms of transparency and opacity, in terms of what's called granulation, if a paint's going to stain, if a paint is going to have kind of a wide range of values in that paint. So lightness or darkness, if there's like a wide range of that in one paint that you can get, or some of them have like a very small window that you can get through just changing your ratio of water. And that's all down to like specific pigments, specific colors. It's not down to your paint brand necessarily, but paint brands also do have their differences. They have their different formulations. And then you've got things like water. Your type of water might make a difference. Distilled water, tap water, bottled water, whatever you're using, it may make a difference in how things behave. Then you've got things like your brush, your other supplies. Basically, I think the main variables are like your environment, your water, your paper, and your paints. I think a lot of the understanding the variables comes down to experimentation, trying things out, getting to know your supplies, allowing yourself to really observe what happens. And if you notice any differences, that's, I think, key for understanding your own specific variables and how you can adjust them, how you can change things to alter what happens. I think that's everything I wanted to kind of touch on for an introduction to the medium, for getting you kind of acquainted with some of the quirks and characteristics of watercolor. So leave a comment, let me know if there are any other unique qualities to watercolor or properties of watercolor that you think I might have missed. And if you are interested in following along in this series, I plan on adding any watercolor related videos to a specific playlist. And then I will also have my videos posted on Substack. I'm also going to try to make them into their own little articles, but we will see if I keep up with that, but I will give it a shot. So, at the very least, you should be able to follow along with any watercolor related videos and content on that Substack. So let me know if you have any suggestions for things that you want me to cover also in this series. I have several things that I'm already working on and planning out, but let me know if there are any things that you have had trouble with as a beginner, and I can see if I can address them. Thanks so much for joining. Take care.